So, I've been hearing a lot of people, especially as of late, hopping onto this bandwagon that decries essentially any remake for an older video game, almost regardless of the amount of remaking that is being done to it, as some kind of moral bankruptcy of video games as an art form. Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Dead Space, Demon's Souls, Metal Gear, Fatal Frame, Halo, Prince of Persia, the list goes on. One of the only exceptions that I can think of offhand that wasn't immediately met with a cavalcade of people shitting on the fact that they're remaking a game instead of just a new one is Elder Scrolls Oblivion. And that wasn't even really a remake. It is technically more of a remaster, although there is enough done here that I think calling it a remake is totally valid due to the graphical overhaul and updated quality of life features that make the game feel much more modern. But that's one of, if not the only example that I can conjure where the conversation around remakes took a step aside and people just enjoyed a thing. Even though I told everybody to play Morrowind instead. So this relatively recent outcry against the very concept of video game remakes isn't something new, at least not in the media space online. YouTube channels like Red Letter Media have been pretty public in their disdain for the soulless nature of the movie industry and their insistence of remakes and legacy sequels that are ostensibly a remake in disguise.
Make that money!
But what's interesting to me about this topic right from the start is the fact that it wasn't even that long ago that video game remakes were something that were never distrusted or outright disliked from the get-go, but were something that people actively wanted. The Resident Evil remake on the GameCube set such a high bar that people actively wanted a remake of Resident Evil 2 for years. It was a dream of mine personally, and I think part of the reason that the actual remake of Resident Evil 2 did as well as it did was because of the hype built around this conceptualized and perfected idealized remake of the second game that so many fans built in their head. And that was because the initial remake of Resident Evil was one of the best survival horror games that has ever been made, and still is more than 20 years later. People clamored Sony for decades to make a remake of Final Fantasy VII. People lost their fucking minds when Sony teased something that looked like it could be a Final Fantasy VII remake, but ended up not being that. People gave up hope. They got that hope built up again and almost immediately crushed, only for the remake to finally be announced, and its announcement alone was one of the highlights of a lot of people's careers. But now you hear a game being remade from the PS1 era or older, or even worse, more recently than that, and you hear this choir of dissatisfied gamers shouting that it goes against the original game's intention, whether that be art direction, gameplay systems, intended vibes, or something else entirely. And it's gotten to the point where the expected take is, why bother? Well, I think I've got a couple of reasons. I want to make an argument for why video game remakes are okay. For now. Before I get started, I do want to clarify some things that I am absolutely not saying. I am not saying that there is any objectivity in art. All art is subjective. If you say art is objective in any way, that's an objectively bad argument. I am not saying that every old video game should be remade. I am not saying that remakes should replace the original. I am not saying that all remakes are necessary. I am not saying that video game remakes can't be soulless cash grabs, and I am not saying that newer video games are inherently better than older ones. With that all being said, video games are art. Video games have come a long way in the past 30 years or so. We went from blip bloops on a screen to essentially photorealistic interactive movies and tabletop concepts that we all have had hidden in our mind's eye to be brought to life in such a way that has inspired millions of artists across the globe. Video games have come such a long way that if you're even close to as old as I am, you saw their movie adaptations go from a laughingstock of both the film and the video game industry to becoming well-respected film and television series. And I think that that is where I want to start. Video games being a work of art have landed themselves in a little brick of a category that I like to call storytelling. Now, are all video games telling a story? Well, yeah, kinda. From Pong to Disco Elysium, Video games tell a story in the same way that chess tells a story, all the way to how a novel tells a narrative. Each iteration and evolution of games have had their own unique ways of conveying that story, but each piece moved in a chess game forwards the narrative in the same way that your mouse choosing dialogue progresses a narrative. And it's because of this that I think I need to convey a concept that I call storytelling dimensions. No, it's not a great name, I know. I think that there are 4 pillars of storytelling that exist. There might be some middle ground between these here and there, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to limit it to what I believe are the 4 core tenets of storytelling. You have the first dimension, a story, a book, a narrative. It is, at its core, literally just the story being told to you. Your mind's eye has to do a lot of the work. While it is simply and arguably an inefficient way to convey a narrative, as you have the highest likelihood of being distracted and cutting yourself away from the story longer than any other of these dimensions that I will present subsequently, this is the most pure form of a narrative. It is essentially the foundation of human creativity. The second dimension, a play, an act, a presentation of the narrative. This is the story being told to you in a visual way, but essentially still at its bare minimum. It is generally very flat visually, not derogatorily, just literally, and most bound by the fourth wall. Often, dialogue is heavy in order to present the story in a way that fits this format. Props could be used, music can be utilized, actions are performed, and the story is essentially being performed. The third dimension is a film, show, animation, an edited visual medium. This expands on the second dimension of storytelling by using visual artistry to a much higher degree, often becoming a narrator of the story itself. Directors have much more of an influence on what is being shown to the viewer. The story is presented in a way that conveys a very specific visual. The fourth dimension are video games. It's all elements of the third dimension, but with the added dimension of mechanics and viewer interaction. Currently, limitless boundaries, potentially untapped possibilities. Now, am I saying that video games are the best form of storytelling? No, but they provide an insight into a narrative that other forms of media simply cannot possibly reach. The simple interactive element of video games is what makes them stand out so prominently in not only my bullshit categories that I made up and put them in, but as a potential strength and a potential weakness in how video games convey their intention. I think a great example of the greatest strength that video games can provide in terms of their mechanics are their subversions of them. A video game conditions us in a way that no other book or movie or singularly told story can really come close to expressing, and that is with its mechanics. Now, to be fair, mechanics for this purpose are not surprisingly also coupled with sound design a lot of the time, such as the jingling of coins in a bag in a game like Diablo, or the simple jingle of a random battle encounter in Undertale can be turned around and twisted into something that is genuinely shocking when utilized against our expectations. Undertale's now famous instance of "but nobody came" is one of the most gut-wrenching moments that a huge majority of gamers got to experience for themselves, whether playing it themselves or watching a streamer go through the shock of that moment.
Nobody came! What? I'm done! Oh shit.
Other dimensions of storytelling may have plot twists and surprises in the narrative, but games are unique in the sense that they can have mechanically intrinsic twists. And these are just some groundworks of what makes mechanics such an intrinsically interesting thing to me. Where my argument really comes into swing regarding remakes, however, is in age itself. Art aging is inevitable. While art never dies, it does decay in some sense. What was once a powerful sentiment becomes trite and boring if given enough time. What was once a powerful plot twist has either been shown to the public zeitgeist or just been around long enough or replicated enough times that its impact has dwindled to a trope. What was once a groundbreaking gameplay system has become outdated, simple, basic, or expected. A board game like Dominion, for instance, is the birthplace of the modern deck building game. It reinvented the very concept of building a deck for games like Magic the Gathering and made the building of the deck itself the entire game. Now, nearly 20 years since Dominion's initial release, there have been thousands of iterations on this very concept. And while Dominion is still a game that sells well, with more expansions coming out seemingly until the end of time, what was once a revolutionary idea has become one of, if not the most simple iterations of that idea. Open world games, at least in the sense that we know them now, are largely spawned from how Bethesda started making them. They were, for at least a long while, the standard for all open world games. And for that long while, nobody could really compete with Bethesda and what they were able to accomplish in their gigantic worlds with their hundreds of dungeons and their many, many quest lines. But basically since The Witcher 3, open world games have become so much more complex, intricate, and now gamers sort of expect more out of a Bethesda game, which is why I think Starfield failed. At least relatively. There's a whole nother video to be made about why I think Bethesda in Elder Scrolls 6 is going to be fine, but that's another day. Dimension 1, the stories, are hardly themselves ever remade. They are iterated and copied, but no author is going to go out of their way to remake Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dimensions 2 and 3 are the ones most often struck by remakes, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to be talking about film as it's the area that I have the most experience with. Why are films remade in the first place? Besides the obvious answer of money and corporate profits, but at their core, in my opinion, films in an artistic sense are remade for at least one of two reasons. One, there was a good movie, or simply one that people unanimously very much enjoyed, that had started showing its age, that someone felt the need to update and make more modern for whatever reason. A good example of this is The Fly, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Psycho! 2, there was a bad movie, or one that people unanimously didn't enjoy, that someone saw something in that inspired a creative spark that they wanted to make a better version of. This is unfortunately a significantly less frequent option, but one that I think needs to be tapped in more often. Now, I think a huge separation between films and video game remakes is that with a lot of modern video game remakes, the trend seems to be leaning towards the first one, where a lot of, if not all, major video game remake releases are of video games that are beloved, potentially genre-defining entries. Which brings up, of course, the obvious question that I think a lot of people have towards remaking old classic films, which is, why bother? Well, you don't play movies, do you? Mechanics are something incredibly nebulous. They are the playable atmosphere of stories, and unlike stories themselves, they age. Faster than it takes for me to fall asleep to the sound of Rich Evans laughing. 20 years is a long time. Think of a beloved movie from the 2000s right now and tell me how bad it is simply because it's aged. Hell, think of a beloved movie from the 80s and really consider that if you showed that to someone that enjoys movies but who had never seen it, how much that they'd likely tell you with a straight face that it's bad because it's outdated or that it doesn't hold up. I think that generally that wouldn't be the case. But if they would say that, would the reason be because of the filmmaking itself? Odds are it would be due to the script or the style of acting, which are, in a sense, the mechanics of the movie. Video games are another step entirely, with all of the faults that progressing techniques that affect films will suffer from, but with the added layer of needing to be fun. At least, generally speaking. Fun evolves. Fun changes. And yet, fun is infinite on another level entirely to something like a movie which is passively interacted with. What older video games suffer from is the lack of foresight. It lacks the reality that mechanics and game design evolved and moves forward. From complex open-world experiences like a Bethesda game that over time gives way to a much more refined and focused game like The Witcher, all the way down to the way that horror games now allow autosaves rather than forcing the player to rely on save points or ink ribbons. An argument that I hear a lot against remakes is that it goes against the initial game's intentions. or clearly established design decisions that inevitably made the old game what it was, and remaking that will go against those intentional choices. People will often say something along the lines of, remakes just make games feel more modern and lose what made the original game special, which sort of implies that the remake is shoving in trends that the original game might not have had. The thing that irks me about this argument is that either these remakes are essentially just graphical overhauls with maybe some added quality of life features added, such as the Demon's Souls remake or hell, even Metal Gear Solid Delta, or these older games were made during a time that had their own trends, and many of these games that are being remade now, while groundbreaking for their own reasons, are the way that they are due to the circumstances of the time that they were made in. Inventory management, fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, all were a thing that the original Resident Evil made famous, but nearly all of those design decisions were a product of its era. It's no secret that Alone in the Dark is the template that Resident Evil copied, but not before they tried implementing a nearly entirely different game altogether. The original Resident Evil was going to be a first-person game with a much heavier emphasis on action, but due to technical limitations, was scrapped and adopted the pre-rendered backgrounds that we now know. So the original vision and intent, whether it was intentional or not, were influenced and made manifest by the things around them at the time. So now when a remake of those games are made now, they of course update things that feel more modern because that's kind of what art is. It's an influence of things that have come before, coming together to make something in the now. All of these modern remakes, from what I've seen and played anyway, pay respect to the original game but take what mechanics haven't quite held up through the meat grinder of time and make them at least a little bit more approachable. But sometimes the developers get to have their cake and eat it too. The Resident Evil 2 remake, for instance, ditches ink ribbons entirely but keeps the typewriters as save points, which decreases the necessity for inventory management as a mechanic, but only for the normal difficulty. If you want that old school experience with the limited ink ribbons, you simply play on hard mode because odds are, if you want the ink ribbons back, you're likely an old school survival horror sicko anyway and wouldn't want the normal difficulty to begin with. Now again, I'm not saying that these evolutions are necessarily better, but what I am saying is that they are more inviting for new people to get into video games as a medium. The reason that I think so many of these remakes are specifically from the early 3D era is because when those games came out, they were genuinely revolutionary. The entire initial 3D generation was revolutionary, nearly regardless of the quality of the games that came out during them, but the ones that have stood the test of time have still likely aged faster than any other generation, before or after. And I'm not saying that they're bad or unplayable, but if you gave a lot of those games that you love to some rando who is mostly used to more modern games, there's a very strong likelihood that they just wouldn't click with it. Look, I love Castlevania 64. I think it's an awesome game. I love its atmosphere. I love its world. I even love its weird clunky mechanical systems. But nearly nobody that is accustomed to more modern gaming trends is going to appreciate it in the way that I do. Sure, there's a chance that they would, and that's awesome. I would love that. But I would never blame anybody for not wanting to invest the time to unlearn a lot of modern game systems or simply grit their teeth through these old mechanics that have been iterated on and refined over the years. Old games are great. They are the reason that games nowadays feel the way that they do. But these old games can be clunky, unintuitive, obtuse, frustrating, and inelegant. That may be what makes them memorable and what gives them charm, but that is something that makes game mechanics beautiful. They can be frustrating. Now, if you're hearing me say all this and getting annoyed at me suggesting that people don't invest the time into these older games, I do understand because video games are an art form and should be appreciated for what they are. But unlike other art forms, video games are not passive experiences. A movie is generally 2 hours. It's an experience that you sit down and intake like vitamins. You might have to think and analyze what you're seeing on the screen in order to fully appreciate it, depending on the movie, but it is not something that you engage with in remotely the same way that you do a video game. The video games that are being chosen to be remade are on the low end around 5 to 10 hour experiences. That's more than double the length of an average movie, and that's not taking into consideration the potential for some of these older games pushing 20, 30, 50, 100 hours to fully take in an experience, let alone fully appreciate. For someone nowadays to have to be expected to grit their teeth through an experience that long to be met with mechanics that are outdated and frustrating is a tall ask, and I think it's reasonable to understand if a lot of people would just abandon the game entirely after too long. Asking people to sit through an entire older game, whether it's a masterpiece or not, isn't too dissimilar to telling someone to read a book whose writing style doesn't really gel with their preferences or sensibilities. And again, I'm not saying that these older games are worse because of their age, and I'm also not saying that people nowadays can't take the time to appreciate the old jank of older generations. What I am saying is, you know how you get a lot of those people foot in the door for those older generations? A remake. And you could make the argument against that argument that you should just make remasters instead. But I don't think a remaster is going to get nearly as much attention as a from the ground up remake. Remasters are for us, the old heads, the ones that have been there when those games came out, longing for a slightly quality of life update or a visual overhaul to some of these games. A remake is the one for the people that weren't there in the first place, that us old heads want to have them experience. Video game remakes should generally be seen as a good thing, but really only if they're clearly intending to pay respects to the intentions of the original game. Remakes will update things, and they will change things, and that's to be expected. What needs to be accomplished and proven is whether or not the game's soul still exists in the remake. Before Silent Hill 2 Remake was officially revealed, there was a video going around of a Silent Hill 2 remake that was just a visual nightmare. It was plagued with all sorts of modern gaming trends at the time, like quest markers, James talking to himself in absurdly edgy monologues, dailies, and more. This was obviously a joke, but it was clearly something that people were worried could happen if the game was given to a bunch of people that didn't respect the original game at all, and only saw the money that could be raked in if a remake of Silent Hill 2 was greenlit. What we got instead is a game that updates and modernizes a lot of that old iconic game with an over-the-shoulder camera and James occasionally saying things to himself, but I would argue that even still it absolutely retains the soul of that original game. It genuinely feels like the game that I remembered, but just updated and expanded to include new things, such as new plot points, new scenes entirely, and even new things to theorize and contemplate over. Developers have learned a lot of mechanical coherence over the past 20 years, and now the fact that it's getting a remake at all means that so many new people are going to give this old legend of the industry a try that literally never would have before. And to be clear, I am not saying that these older games are worse because of their age, and I am also not saying that people nowadays can't take the time to appreciate the old jank from older generations. What I am saying, though, is that a remake is a good way to get a lot of people's foot in the door of those older games that you and I love and champion. I posted 2 polls on my YouTube channel that tried to get some semblance of a sense of what people experienced when it came to remakes. The first question was asking people if their first interaction with Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil 2, if Silent Hill didn't apply, was with the original or the remake. I got 128 votes. 32% of those people played the remake first. Now, that does mean that 68% of those 128 people played the original first, but 32% is not an insignificant number. The second question I asked was if you played the remake of any game without having played the original, did it make you in any way interested in the original game? Now this garnered 85 votes, but I got 71% of that 85 saying that they were interested to go back or had already gone back to the original game. Now that is a huge majority of people that are telling me that the remake intrigued them to go back and experience the older game, which is what the argument against remakes is always saying. People worry that remakes take away from the older games. They worry that it's going to erase the original art. And I'm telling you that if anything, they shine a light on that older game that likely would have never been there for a large amount of the gaming public. What so many remakes are doing right now is giving these older games not only new life, but a chance to be seen through a modern lens to a swarm of new people that would have never given the original game that you potentially hold very dear to your heart a chance. But on top of that, I think that many of these remakes have been taking the same concepts of the original Resident Evil remake on the GameCube, which added new plot points, new areas, and new puzzles that gave fans of the original game a chance to experience the game for the first time all over again. And I think that this is an overlooked aspect to a lot of these remakes. How many of us have had a game that we hold dear to our hearts and have uttered the phrase, "I wish I could experience it for the first time all over again"? Well, remakes like the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, every Resident Evil remake, the Silent Hill 2 remake, and even the Dead Space remake to some extent, all either simply bring new things to the experience or transform the original game entirely, making the first run-through of the remake something that is as close as we will ever get to experiencing something for the first time again. And honestly, that alone makes the idea of a remake from the get-go something that I think that is worth looking forward to. And that's essentially the point that I'm trying to make here, and that is geared around the point that remakes are still art. You may call remakes a cash grab. You may accuse the corporations greenlighting these remakes as soulless vessels that are simply trying to print money, and you would be right. But you know who isn't a soulless vessel simply interested in netting profits? The studios and the teams behind them. And the quality of a lot of these remakes are proof enough if you ask me. The amount of times that I've felt that the studio behind them were making a game for a paycheck is shockingly small. Dead Space, Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Metal Gear, Demon's Souls, Final Fantasy, Pac-Man, Tony Hawk, Pro Skater, Dragon's Quest, Black Mesa, Metroid. You cannot tell me that these are soulless games. You may not like them, and that's totally fine, but these games are works of art made by a passionate team of people that clearly want to make something special. It seems weird to be so dismissive of something clearly made by passion, whether or not that passion is fueled by an extra third party simply interested in a cash grab, because really, that's what funded a lot of the works of art that are getting remade now in the first place. There may come a time when the fuel that burns the fire of capitalism turns into nothing but passionless developers being shoved onto a remake product to turn a profit. That day will be more likely to arrive than not. But that day is not today. Video game remakes are okay. For now.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.
Why did I make this video?